Hi everyone. Today I'm going to walk through a few different study plans that you can implement if you're struggling with timing on cars and you really want to improve on that. And so I have them listed out here, but they're very flexible and you can kind of customize it to what works for you, kind of where you're at. So there's a few different approaches, and I've kind of outlined the three main ones. And so when a student comes to me with timing issues, let's say that their baseline time for both the passage and the questions is around 15 minutes, as an example. And maybe they want to bring it down to around 10 minutes, like that's their goal timing. Probably the most standard plan that I think a lot of people often recommend is you want to start off with your baseline time, 15 minutes, and then as each week goes by, you maybe want to cut it down to 14 and a half, 14. And if you wanted to do it in 1 minute increments, you definitely can, of like 14 minutes, 13 minutes, etc. We'll try to maintain about 75% accuracy on your questions. So this will force you to think about what strategies you can implement both to read the passage really well, but also to go through the questions. And this one is a much more gradual pace of how you can improve. And so this plan, I think, works better if someone has more time on their study plan. Something like maybe if they're 2 months or 3 months out, there's a little bit more flexibility to work with it. And if, especially if you're around like 4 to 6 months out, then this is something you can do that is less strenuous and also like kind of fits maybe if people's schedule changes and whatnot. But let's say you don't have that much time. You're a little bit closer to your exam and you're really looking for some kind of solution. So this is your first plan. The second plan that I've been really trying out with people, and it can either be solely this first bullet point, solely this, or not second, first bullet point, second bullet point, solely this third one, or a combination of both, is first trying out timing yourself per paragraph instead of timing yourself for the whole passage. So what that does is it's going to force you to budget your time more effectively while you're reading. This will usually prevent rereading. It'll prevent getting stuck on kind of like one part of the sentence and getting hung up on that. And it'll force you to focus more on like the stuff that you do understand in a passage and get a better, more comprehensive view of the whole thing that they're talking about. Because really, you only need about maybe 70, I would say, to 75% of the content to be able to answer a good number of questions. Ideally, you want to push it up to maybe like 80%, etc. But this is a good place to start. And so you can try timing yourself for about a minute and a half per paragraph. So what that would kind of look like is if you've got, let's say, 5 paragraphs in the passage, you want to give yourself a 1.5 minute range for each one. Now, if a paragraph is longer and it takes you 2 minutes, that's perfectly fine, especially when you're practicing, because longer and shorter paragraphs, you kind of have to adapt to it. So let's say the first one takes you around 1.5 and 2 minutes. Let's say the second paragraph is shorter, it takes you 1 minute. It doesn't mean you have to take up the entire 1.5 minute time. You can take a moment, think about the main idea, and move on from there. And let's say all of these are pretty consistent, and maybe the last paragraph takes you a little bit longer, let's say around 2 minutes. So the nice thing about practicing this way, and you can use a stopwatch on your phone to kind of track it, you click lap on the stopwatch and that should be able to let you look at your timing for each paragraph, is you can kind of see like which parts of the passage did you get stuck on? Did you end up rereading and kind of bogging yourself down with timing? Or are there other things that you can do to improve your comprehension? So that's kind of the second one. The third option that you can do, and this is again, if you just decide to do the third technique in isolation, is to time yourself per question. And timing yourself for about 1.5 minutes per question is something I found that's been really helpful for people. Just for context, for the second technique, because I forgot to mention this, I had a student who went from literally around 15 to 20 minutes per passage, so just the passage itself, to around 6 to 7 minutes of reading. And I realized that most of the issues that were coming up is she would get hung up kind of reading each paragraph over and over again. I think a lot of students like had this similar trend where they'd be around 15 minutes and cut it down to half, because they were so focused on, oh, I need to understand like every single detail in this paragraph. You definitely don't have to. It helps, but especially when you're trying to just build a good foundation for comprehension and accuracy, you don't have to understand every single detail. Um, and honestly, like reading the rest of the passage can sometimes help you figure out kind of if you were foggy on something you read earlier, what were those details? Um, okay, so got a little stride track, but let's go over the third technique, which is timing yourself per question. So again, if you've got like, let's say 6 questions, you want to time yourself for about a minute and a half. And again, let that stopwatch kind of run in the background. Once you near about 1.5 minutes, if you don't have an answer for the question, or you're kind of bouncing between two answers, or you're backtracking and like uncrossing some answers that you had crossed out. Basically, if you're not confident in an answer, flag it and do the other questions. And so this 1.5 minutes per question is really helpful because it teaches you how to budget your time effectively. It also prevents students from kind of like getting hung up on like one particular question and then missing out on other questions that they can answer and possibly sometimes easier points to grab. So let's say for number one, it took you around a minute and a half and you flagged it and you moved on. Let's say number two, you're really comfortable on, so it only took you a minute. You can move on. Let's say it took about a minute and a half, but you felt good about it. And let's say for number four, it's taking you a while. Like you're approaching maybe almost like 2 minutes per se. That's when at that 1.5 minute mark, you kind of have to catch yourself and say, okay, if I'm not sure, I'm going to flag it and keep going. Let's say it takes you a minute for number five and another minute and a half for number six, but you feel good about it. Now, when you have these questions that you flagged, if you got stuck on it earlier and spent like 3 minutes on it or 2.5 minutes on it, you lose out on the opportunity to basically get possibly, I'm not saying, all the time people get it, but you increase your chances of getting points for the other four problems. And now, once you've confidently gone through the questions for this passage and you feel good about it, you can go back to those over here and spend a little bit more time on those to figure out, okay, how can I cross off some of these answers? Am I using the right passage information, etc.? So it's a really good way of preventing the frustration that students have and also preventing some of the panic that students experience when they're going through questions and they're thinking in their head, oh, I have to get through the other ones, but then they're also worried about timing. So this helps you balance out both. And I guess kind of like the fourth one for this is you can combine both of these techniques. So if the passage is more challenging for you, go ahead with the second one. If the questions you feel like are taking up more time for you, go ahead with the third one. And once you've kind of worked on which area you're more weak on, you can always combine the two and time yourself per paragraph as well as time yourself per questions. I have some students who wean off of this, and once they get comfortable pacing themselves through the passage and they no longer have to time themselves per paragraph, you can do like an overall timing of something like maybe like 4 to 6 minutes, just depending on how fast you read. And kind of as a side note, I know a lot of people think that there is an ideal timing that you have to hit, in particular for reading the passage only. So I have students who say, oh, I should only hit like 3 minutes or I should only hit 4 minutes. Like those are, I think, big misconceptions. You have to read for, I would say safely, 4 to 6 minutes. If you read faster than that and you're still able to answer the questions, that's perfectly fine. But 6 minutes is not a bad time to have on the passage. I say that because, especially if comprehension is your biggest challenge or English is your second language and you have a hard time understanding the details in the passage, rushing through that process can make it a lot harder to answer the questions. And that will either increase the time on your questions or drastically decrease your accuracy. So take your time on the passage, especially when you're starting off in your prep. Take about 6 minutes to read it and use the remainder of the time to answer the questions. Because the trend I've seen with many of the students I've worked with, especially when English is their second language, is they take the time on the passage, they go through the questions a lot faster and they do a lot better in terms of accuracy. So these are kind of three approaches that you can take. And of course, you can combine the last two once you feel comfortable and have addressed, your major weaknesses. So you may be asking, which one should I try out? You can start off always with the first one. That's a good place to start. But if you realize that you cannot cut down your time while maintaining that 75% accuracy, then you need to try out number two or number three and see where exactly is my weakness. Another thing you can do is just kind of split up that baseline time. So just time yourself on a passage and see how long it takes you to get through the passage plus the questions. So let's say that's 15 minutes overall. And then time yourself just for the passage and just for the questions, because that will show you which one is taking you longer. Like if it's taking you 8 minutes for the passage, but maybe you can breeze through the questions in maybe even like 6 to 7 minutes, then this is where you probably want to start. You can start off with plan number 2, then you can move on to try out plan number 3 and kind of like group them together to overall decrease your timing. But yeah, you can go ahead and pause this if you want and take a look at it, because I kind of scribbled all over it, but 3 different options that you can try. Now, in terms of weekly practice, I know sometimes students get a little bit nervous if they don't do time practice throughout the week. So there's definitely kind of like a way that you can fix that as much as possible. But the main thing is that at baseline, if you're noticing you're getting a ton of questions wrong and you don't know why you're getting them wrong, then you want to spend a couple of days of doing untimed practice and trying out the different strategies that we cover in these videos during those 3 to 4 days. So these are kind of questions you want to ask yourself as you're going through the process to figure out what strategies you want to keep and which ones you want to let go of. In terms of accuracy, if you're doing great, but you're still struggling with timing, or you're just like not really sure where that balance is, then you can split up your week into some untimed days and timed days. So this 3 and 4 day number is really flexible. Let's say you're working like a working student. You're working about maybe 3 or 4 days out of the week. So you have roughly, let's say, like 3 days that you can do some cars practice. When you're starting off, it's better to give yourself some more untimed days. So you could do 2 untimed plus 1 time day. Let's say you're working less hours and you have about maybe, let's say 4 to 5 days out of the week to study. And let's say, hey, you're like, I'm doing really well untimed. However, I'm having a harder time with time practice and implementing the strategies that you do in a time setting. So you can always start off with about, let's say 3 to 4 days untimed. And I'll put in 1 to 2 days timed. And once you feel comfortable doing it untimed, you can kind of transition into flipping it. So you may want to do 1 to 2 days untimed to refine any strategies that you worked on, and 3 to 4 days timed so that you get in the groove of it. So why do you want to split up your week into time versus untimed? Untimed days are kind of like your slower practice days where you get to try out the strategies that you've worked on, refine those, and also see kind of how it works for you. So any strategies that I cover, you can change them based on what you like better. And then for your time days, it's really, really helpful to kind of give yourself time practice so that you get used to operating under that pressure condition, but also so that you get used to trying out the different strategies you're working on faster. So you can see, are there any shortcuts that I can do to make this strategy better? Are there any changes I can make? All that kind of stuff. So when you're thinking about how to time yourself for those time days, you want to give yourself slightly below your baseline time or around 10 minutes per passage. So let's say, again, your baseline time is maybe 15 minutes. You want to start off with about, I would say, like 14 minutes. And you can gradually decrease it to 13, 12, etc. If your baseline time is already like 11 minutes, then you can probably time yourself for 10 minutes per passage and be okay. So if your baseline is, again, anywhere around 11 to 12 minutes, you can try 10 minutes per passage and see if it works for you. And kind of the same thing that we talked about, gradually increase the amount of time practice that you're doing so that you can build accuracy. And once you get comfortable with these stages, then you can add in consecutive passages. So if you're someone who's got maybe like 2 hours of cars practice that you can dedicate for a few days in a week, you want to transition from maybe like 2 to 3 passages per day to maybe one day of doing almost 4 to 5 passages. And ideally, you want to maintain around 70 to 75% accuracy. If you realize that you're getting fatigued at around 5 passages, you may want to bring it down to 3 to 4. And so doing it consecutively will help you with endurance and timing. And it's very flexible. So again, if you get really tired at 5 passages, but you don't have time to finish it, then you should try to do at least like 3 to 4 passages and see how that goes. And so in terms of timing itself, How do you time yourself for consecutive passages? You do either your baseline time or you do 10 minutes per passage. So if your baseline time is like 12 minutes, you can try doing 11 minutes per passage, and just doing that back to back, or doing 10 minutes per passage, depending on how comfortable you are. And so this is a good overview, I think, of different plans and ways that you can implement timed versus kind of like building accuracy into your weekly and daily CARS practice. So hopefully this was helpful for you. Go ahead and check out my TikTok page if you want some shorter kind of form content. I'll also be posting them on YouTube. And again, please support this channel in any way that you can. That includes kind of like subscribing, commenting down below any questions you have, sharing this with a friend who's also going through CARS practice, or supporting with a donation. I know finances is tough for folks. We're out here balling on a budget. So any way that you can show your support, I'd really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you for your time today.